This video will cover sensitive topics and contain spoilers for the Metal Gear Solid series. Viewer discretion is advised. The year is 2012, and Kojima Productions is on the verge of completely changing the identity of its biggest franchise, Metal Gear Solid. While on the surface they were, along with the assistance of Konami, advertising the upcoming release of the spin-off game Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, behind the scenes, Hideo Kojima was working on creating the shining moment for both his career and the Metal Gear series as a whole. The latest mainline game for the Metal Gear series at this point was the 2010 PlayStation Portable title Metal Gear Solid: Peace Walker. Reviews for Peace Walker were proclaiming it as one of the best in the series, citing the robust story, fluid controls, and great graphics, all of which were able to fit on a handheld console. But right after the release of Peace Walker, Kojima Productions would begin development on the next mainline Metal Gear Solid game under the name Project Ogre. Project Ogre, or Project Oni in Japan, is derived from the announcement that this next game would involve demonic figures, and that the game would be tackling a lot of taboo and dark subjects that the Metal Gear series hadn't touched up to this point. When Ground Zeroes broke off from the Phantom Pain, it would lose the Project Ogre pseudonym, so from this point on, when I refer to the project, just know that I am referencing this point in development in which the two games were one. As Project Ogre was in development, Hideo Kojima would slowly start drip-feeding Metal Gear fans bits of information about his new game, stating that it would be fully open-world, multi-platformed, and designed with a global audience in mind, along with the bombshell that Project Ogre would introduce a new gaming concept called transferring. Transferring was the concept of having a singular save file that could be transferred or shared between consoles. Once again, Hideo Kojima is ahead of the curve, finding a way to have cloud saves in his games before cloud saves even existed. While the feature would not be present in Metal Gear Solid 5, it was in the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, featuring ports of the original two MSX Metal Gear games, as well as high-definition upgrades of Metal Gear Solid 2, 3, and Peace Walker, with save data that could be transferred between the consoles, such as the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation 3. Along with the planned implementation of the transferring feature was the development of the brand new proprietary Fox engine. Up to this point, the Metal Gear Solid series, outside of 4, used a proprietary engine that was built off of prior games in the series, most notably the engine that was used in Metal Gear Solid 2. Both 3 and Peace Walker had their engines tweaked based off of the original design of Metal Gear Solid 2's. Since Metal Gear Solid 4 was the first game in the series to be released on high-definition consoles, it required the use of the Havoc engine. But Kojima still felt limited by the restrictions of the Havoc engine, feeling the engine wasn't pushing the limits of the newly released PlayStation 3. Immediately after the release of Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots, Kojima Productions began work on a brand new engine to be used exclusively in games made by the studio. Work on the Fox engine started with Kojima Productions recruiting new developers under the pseudonym Developers Without Borders, in reference to the name of the paramilitary group in Peace Walker, with the prospect of developing next-gen engine technology targeted for high-end consoles and PCs. The engine was first shown off at E3 2011 in a discussion with Metal Gear creator Hideo Kojima. He claims that the goal of the engine is to allow for great games to be made for a wider variety of platforms with shorter development times, citing his upcoming, unannounced game as one of the first to showcase the intricacies of the engine. When looking at modern gaming engines, it may be worth asking, what made the Fox engine the choice for Kojima Productions, instead of sticking with the Havok engine or switching to popular alternatives such as Unreal or Unity? Well, in their goal to develop an engine that would allow for multi-platform game development, the Fox engine actually renders its light and geometry separately, whereas other engines render everything all at once. This separation in the rendering of things such as the game world, player models, or objects in-game makes it so that the game can run on consoles or PC, with the independent lighting rendering ensuring that everything looks at a high quality, regardless of the platform in which you play the game on. Metal Gear games have always pushed the boundaries of video game visuals. I know the original Metal Gear Solid isn't much to gawk at now, but back in 1998, the game was applauded for how realistic it looked, with 2 and 3 taking monumental leaps in only a single console generation. And while Kojima Productions had its reservations about the Havok engine, it made Metal Gear Solid 4 look phenomenal, and the game still holds up as one of the best looking on the 7th generation of consoles. But all of those games pale in comparison to the visuals and lighting of Metal Gear Solid 5. Both Ground Zeroes and The Phantom Pain do a phenomenal job in the visuals department, with the games looking like they could compete with even the best looking games over a decade later on Unreal Engine 5. The way that lighting in general is used not only to showcase the beauty of the world, but also as a gameplay mechanic to indicate potential danger is just one of the ways that Kojima has blended visuals with the mechanics of his games. Metal Gear Solid 5 was also the only game in the series to use the game's English cast as a basis for its facial capture. While 4 introduced facial capture to the series to enhance the realism of cutscenes, it would be done first with the Japanese cast and later dubbed over with the English voice actors. But choosing to use the English cast first makes these cutscenes look almost movie-like, thanks to the way that the detailed facial cues are synced with dialogue alongside the cinematography that allowed the Metal Gear Solid series to stand out against every other AAA title. Just based on the aspirations of this engine and 5's development, it's no surprise that conflict arose between Kojima and Konami due to the cost of Project Ogre. The last mainline game in the series, Metal Gear Solid 4, had a development cost of around $70 million, which, accounting for inflation today, would have been the 16th most expensive game of all time to develop. So Kojima had already begun to push the boundaries of what was acceptable by Konami. And with Project Ogre being teased as a revolutionary title in the series that would shake up the foundation of what Metal Gear was built on prior, Hideo Kojima's seat as the series director was starting to get a little hot, despite the long-standing success and high profit margins brought in by every one of his titles. Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes originally had a more expedited development timeline in order to be released right after Peace Walker on the PSP. But with the next generation of consoles right around the corner, Ground Zeroes development would slow down as the title would release as a cross-generational title. It would be on August 30th, 2012, where Hideo Kojima would officially unveil Project Ogre as Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes at a private event celebrating the series' 25th anniversary. While we don't necessarily know what went on behind closed doors, we can assume that it was pretty similar to the reveal at PAX Prime only 2 days later, that showed off the game's opening cutscenes as well as a few minutes of Ground Zeroes' gameplay, as well as mentioning that this game would not be an end, but a beginning, a prologue to the then unannounced Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, along with the bombshell that this next chapter in the Metal Gear Solid series would take the leap into the open world. Originally, the two titles were to be released as one, Ground Zeroes serving as a prologue mission to build up the grandness that was The Phantom Pain. As director Hideo Kojima expressed in an interview with Famitsu magazine in 2013, The prologue, Ground Zeroes, is like the first 10 to 15 minutes of a Hollywood movie. The hook. Something amazing happens at the beginning, the title appears, and then 9 years later it starts from a different place. But due to the sheer amount of work that would go into crafting an open world for the setting of the Phantom Pain, the two games had to be split up. In that same interview, Kojima states, "That's the connection as a story, and as a game. The Phantom Pain is an open world with a vast map, while Ground Zeroes is a slightly smaller open world. It would be better if they were released together. I think we can release it by the time the PlayStation 4 becomes popular, but we'll have to wait a little longer." The Metal Gear Solid series is primarily stealth-oriented, and to no surprise, Ground Zeroes follows this same philosophy, but the methods in which you maintain your stealth throughout this new, open world are completely new to the series. Being an open world game, your options for infiltration, exploration, combat, and even your entire gameplay style are completely up in the air. Taking Metal Gear Solid 3 for example, there's a moment early on in the game in Bolshaya Pass South where you have to make it through a section filled with guards, electric fences, and yes, claymores. There are a handful of different ways to get through this area. You could stick to the east side and only have the guards to worry about, relying more on combat and secrecy. But there's also the west side, which may pose some more trouble with the decently hidden claymore mines and electric fences that block your path. Well, in Ground Zeroes, your primary objective is to sneak into the Camp Omega military base, rescue 2 hostages, and leave. That's it. And the way you go about doing that is completely up to you. Of course, the game tries to guide you in a certain direction at multiple points, such as the beginning where you're encouraged to remain on the upper path of rocks to stay out of sight from the guards, and drop into the base from above. But you could also sneak in undetected by picking the lock on the fence door, so long as no one's watching. Or go up into this searchlight tower, take out the guard, and drop in from there. All of this within the first 5 minutes of gameplay, and you're hardly any closer to the section of the base you're interested in. Unlike previous Metal Gear games, there's no longer a minimap to aid you in where you need to go, which is a bold thing to exclude, especially in an open world game. It's completely up to you to survey your surroundings and mark your enemies, which is a breeze thanks to your binoculars and the all-new iDroid, which serves as an all-in-one hub for looking at your map, calling in support, reviewing mission objectives, and even listen to cassette tapes in-game. In that same section on the upper path of rocks that I mentioned earlier, you're introduced to the function of tagging enemies with your binoculars. This serves a similar function to the minimap, which would show where enemies are in your vicinity and which direction they may be facing, a necessary inclusion due to the camera and console limitations of previous games. With your binoculars, you're able to look far across the map and tag things such as enemies, searchlights, vehicles, security cameras, and even heavy artillery such as these anti-aircraft turrets you'll find scattered throughout Camp Omega. Once these enemies are marked, not only will they show up on your iDroid, but also in-game as markers in your peripheral. As odd as it sounds, it works, helping add tension and encouraging you to be a bit more cautious than you normally would be in other open world games, and even other Metal Gear games since the enemy direction indicator is now gone. The menu navigation in Ground Zeroes gets a notable step up from prior games, and it's one of the first things you'll notice. Where before you'd have to tediously cycle through all your items in order to equip what you may be looking for, Ground Zeroes relegates that entirely to the D-pad, giving each item specific classifications, such as primary weapons for rifles and other similar guns, secondary weapons for the multitude of handguns you can find all over the map, support weapons like explosive devices or empty magazines to draw the attention of guards, and equipables such as the night vision goggles or the ever iconic cardboard box. Once you've been playing the game for a little bit, it makes the whole process of weapon or gear switching extremely easy and far less time consuming than prior games in the series. It also helps to keep you immersed in the game, since it limits the time that you have to spend navigating menus while the world around you remains frozen. All of this is to aid Ground Zeroes' combat and world interaction, keeping you engaged with what's going on in-game, without the risk of breaking your immersion by navigating through menu after menu just to change what items you have selected. The open world greatly expands the number of ways you can tackle Ground Zeroes' objectives. If a part of your brain thinks that what you're about to do is even possible to pull off, it likely is. And the game will probably even reward you for your ingenuity with weapons, cassette tapes, or secret objectives that are scattered all around the base. Close quarters combat has been improved upon from how it was in Metal Gear Solid 3, 4, and Peace Walker, which is fitting since you're playing as Big Boss, one of the two people to develop the fighting technique. The grab and choke techniques are still present, with both being able to interrogate enemies you restrain. Upon your first instance of restraining an enemy, you'll receive a codec call informing you that you can get some information out of the enemies you subdue. While not necessary for completing Ground Zeroes' major objective, enemies can mark the location of other guards, security cameras, weapons, and other things that may aid you in your stealth raid on Camp Omega. If things get too heated and you have a whole group of enemies in your way, the new mechanics of CQC allow you to land a quick succession of blows to knock out enemies or even slam them violently on the ground to incapacitate them. Of course, you'll always have the option to kill enemies you come across, be it silently stabbing them while they're restrained or shooting them, but you're encouraged to complete this mission non-lethally, thanks to the point bonuses and the fact that patrolling guards can spot corpses and send the base into lockdown, making your job much harder to complete. But incapacitating guards won't serve as your only roadblock in completing the game. Taking out security cameras, stealing equipment, leaving doors open, basically anything that would indicate enemy presence will alert Camp Omega HQ, and they'll send reinforcements to check out the area and even put the base into alert stage, where guards will begin to look around more secluded areas you may think to hide in. I would argue that this is what makes Metal Gear Solid 5 take a step up in comparison to prior games in the series. The dynamic state of the game's world and its inhabitants make them feel like more than the AI programming that composes their entire being. The way that guards and even the game systems interact and adapt to your inventiveness makes the world feel lived in and adds to the game's realism outside of its harrowing story and jarring themes that shine a light on the part of society we feign ignorance to. All of these new, varied gameplay features are used to highlight the open world aspect of Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. Ground Zeroes serving as a smaller playground to test out a lot of the features that would later be improved upon in the Phantom Pain nearly a year later. The freedom this game gives you in how to navigate the base, even if you're not heading towards the objective, the way it rewards you for your creativity, thinking outside the box, and the ability to remain hidden while doing so, makes this one of the best Metal Gear Solid experiences of all time. Tons of videos and articles praise the Phantom Pain for the way it integrates these features into an open world, which is a challenge in and of itself. But offering this sense of freedom within a more enclosed, detailed area where the risks are higher and you can't just run to the other side of the map, perfectly blends what the Metal Gear Solid series was up to this point, with the new, bold direction that the series' final game would be taking. Solely from a gameplay experience, this is one of the most important Metal Gear games, expanding the player's possibilities and setting up the mechanics that would be fully fleshed out in the sequel. There are so many nuanced and clever gameplay mechanics and quirks that people are still discovering new quirks over a decade later. While genre-defining gameplay has always been an integral part of why Metal Gear Solid is so beloved by the public and gaming outlets alike, it's always been the game's stories which have left a lasting impact on their players, and Ground Zeroes is no exception. In fact, Ground Zeroes may serve as the shining example for Hideo Kojima's goal to highlight real-world matters that have been overlooked by the general populace. As the third, maybe fourth if you count Portable Ops, game in the chronological timeline, it's important to look at where the Metal Gear canon sat at Ground Zeroes' release. Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes takes place mere months after the events of Peace Walker. At the end of that game, Naked Snake, now going by Big Boss, defeated the double agent Paz Ortega Andrade, who took control of Metal Gear Zeke in order to get Snake and his paramilitary group, MSF, to obey the will of the secret organization known as Cypher. Ground Zeroes begins with the information that Paz was not in fact killed by the explosion of Metal Gear Zeke, which flung her into the Caribbean Sea. The girl was actually rescued by a Belizean fisherman and handed over to Cypher for interrogation at Camp Omega, located at the southern tip of Cuba. Chico, another ally of Snake and MSF, attempted to sneak into Camp Omega and rescue Paz, who he had a little crush on. But one kid against the combined forces of the United States military and Cypher went about as well as you could have expected. Both Chico and Paz were tortured for information pertaining to Big Boss and MSF, as well as the location of Zero, the Grand Master behind all of Cypher's operations. It's here where we get a glimpse into the darker themes Kojima wanted to address with Metal Gear Solid 5. Camp Omega serves as a CIA black site, stated by Kaz at the beginning of the game, highlighting exactly why the mission to infiltrate the base has to be so secretive, since the political firestorm that would ensue following the discovery of MSF's involvement would, for lack of a better term, not be good. The black site serves as a means for XOF to employ enhanced interrogation techniques to prisoners who were illegally and immorally obtained, without any fear of backlash from the government. Since the base was on leased Cuban land, it was far outside any American jurisdiction, so the camp's prisoners were not given the civil liberties that a normal American prisoner was, allowing their captors to employ extreme and illegal forms of torture. Kojima likely took inspiration for the existence and in-universe nature of Camp Omega from the at the time controversy surrounding the United States' operations at Guantanamo Bay. About half a year after the release of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, a Bush-appointed official confirmed that the US Department of Defense had used extreme torture methods on at least one detainee at Guantanamo Bay. The 8 years that followed were filled with attempts to relocate terrorism suspects onto US soil, permanently cease operations at the military base, and use the Freedom of Information Act to find out more about the kinds of torture that the US would employ on these prisoners. Given that the real-life facility has areas labeled Camp Delta and Camp Echo, saying that the fictional base of Camp Omega drew inspiration from the controversial base isn't much of a stretch. This is the introduction to these taboo themes that Kojima aimed to cover with the next installment in the Metal Gear Solid franchise. One of the many examples throughout the series where these horrific acts aren't just fictional, but are there to showcase things that we often have to turn a blind eye to. While we thankfully don't get to see the extent of the torture performed on Chico and Paz, we do get to see the results. The first goal of the mission is to locate Chico, and based upon the distress signal he sent, he's being kept in a prison facility with inhumane conditions. These prisoners are kept in animal cages with no protection against the elements, and many of them were victims of torture. Chico was brainwashed to think that Snake would come to kill him, and to prevent the boy from attempting to escape, his Achilles tendons were bolted, preventing him from using his legs. A 13-year-old boy, with a bolt shot straight through one of the strongest and most important tendons in the body, making him completely unable to support his own weight. My God. As one last parting message, the game's central antagonist and leader of XOF, Skullface, gives Chico a tape recording of Paz's final moments to scar the boy even more after all the physical and psychological torture he's already been through. Extracting him is heartbreaking. Hearing his cries for Paz and all the guilt he feels for her supposed death, and how he was forced to be a part of her torture. Snake takes the tape from Chico, skeptical of Paz's death. So now you're forced to use audio clues from the tape in order to track down where they took her, in order to confirm whether or not she's truly dead, to finally end this tumultuous chapter in MSF's history. Here's where the gameplay opens up more. In a confined space like the interior of a military base, you're gonna need to get creative with the way you maneuver without being spotted. Silently incapacitating guards and taking down security cameras are essential to getting to Paz without alerting the enemy. Patience and timing are key here, especially once you find her. It turns out Paz was kept on the brink of death, chained up in the camp's boiler room. And with your extraction location being further and the route there being more heavily patrolled than what was the case for Chico, you can't just run out of Camp Omega with Paz on your shoulder. It's imperative to do it quickly before the guards come back and see that she's missing, putting the base in high alert mode. So this is where we get to see the peak of Metal Gear Solid gameplay. In prior games, you could often wait quite a while, remaining undetected until the perfect opportunity to slip past some guards. While before picking up Paz that was the case, if you wait too long, escaping will be a lot steeper of a task, with the base going into lockdown. It's a perfect blend of urgency and patience, heightening the gameplay since you can't just wait around until the conditions are perfect for your escape. You're gonna have to take some risks, temporarily dropping Paz to perform other actions to secure your escape route to avoid being seen. There were numerous instances where I'd have a perfect run up until rescuing Paz. No alerts, silently taking out every guard I've come across. But once I have to consider the health and movement restrictions that come with carrying another person, the limitations that the game places on you actually serve to enhance the overall experience and show you the beauty of restraints. The gameplay of the first mission ends once you successfully extract Paz. Although the mission normally lasts about 50 minutes to an hour, the numerous ways to infiltrate and interact with Camp Omega don't serve as the only way to entice repeat playthroughs. There's a ton of side ops to help encourage exploration of Camp Omega and fully prepare yourself for these new, open-world controls that would be fleshed out in the sequel game Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. While basic objectives, the way you can go about completing them is where the fun lies. The tasks are as simple as eliminating 2 high-priority soldiers and then escaping, destroying some anti-aircraft artillery, extracting a highly skilled soldier, and sneaking in to recover some data. These are all really simple requests, but it allows you to see Camp Omega in a new time of day, with better weather conditions to really appreciate the work that went into developing the map that would serve as a bridge between the old style of Metal Gear and the new style that we're hoping to achieve. There's even a side op where player and enemy models get replaced by their Metal Gear Solid 1 counterparts. A really nice bit of fan service. After successfully extracting Paz, the game reaches its climax with a series of cutscenes building up your anticipation for the full Metal Gear Solid 5 experience, which would release over a year later. On the helicopter ride back to Mother Base, Chico notices that Paz is still actively bleeding, revealing a series of sutures along her abdomen where XOF rigged her with a bomb, anticipating Snake and MSF to come to the rescue of the two hostages. With the clock against them, the onboard medic, Snake, and Chico are forced to open her up to remove the bomb, without any anesthetics. The cinematography of this scene alone might be better than anything else we've seen from the franchise. The fast cuts and brief glimpses we get of the operation really make you feel as if you're out of the loop, and in a situation like this, you're gonna be wanting to know more. Seeing the guilt and worry on Chico's face as he's forced to hold in Paz's gut is really difficult, since he's convinced himself that he loves this girl. Thankfully, the medic is able to remove the explosive device and subsequently throw it out of the chopper. But as they open the door to do so, they see the wreckage of what was once Mother Base. If you've played Peace Walker, you'll understand just how heartbreaking this is. Seeing the base that you've spent time and resources building up over the course of the prior game being taken down in the short amount of time Snake was out rescuing Chico and Paz, it's just hard. Prior to the game's start, MSF was due for an inspection to make sure that the military group didn't possess any nuclear-capable weapons. While they could have just as easily turned down the UN-mandated inspection, former enemy turned head engineer Huey Emmerich went behind everyone's back and sent a letter stating that MSF had nothing to hide and that an inspection was welcomed. So Mother Base was disarmed and unsuspecting on this particular day. Expecting a standard United Nations inspection, they were instead hit with a Trojan horse. XOF's agents storming the base, killing any MSF soldier they could see with the goal of finally eliminating the world's most famous and dangerous soldier, Big Boss. Mother Base had several of its platforms fall into the ocean, the base and its buildings a sea of fire and debris. What remaining soldiers are there are fighting, showing the everlasting devotion they've given to the man they call their leader. It's a really harrowing glimpse into the sense of loyalty a lot of soldiers give their life for, an entity that oftentimes doesn't care about the people fighting for it, viewing them only as a number to stack up against other nations. A really good callback to the themes of Metal Gear Solid 3, how soldiers are often left with nothing to fight for once they've done their job, and are often left looking for something, anything to give them purpose. This attack on Mother Base shows where that can lead people who never stop fighting. Snake attempts to get out and help his men fight, but he's forced to retreat, being able to save his biggest ally, Kazuhira Miller, who delivers the best and most iconic line from this game.
They played us like a damn fiddle! Give it back! This isn't right, that was ours!
Kaz's adrenaline turns to anger as he focuses his attention on Paz, blaming her for giving up all the information on Mother Base for XOF to easily swoop in and take out MSF. In her dazed state, she's only able to muster up 2 sentences.
There's another in my...
That's right. There was a second bomb. Through side ops, you can find deeper information, revealing that Paz wouldn't have lasted another 48 hours due to all the organs that XOF had to remove in order to fit 2 bombs inside of her. One being, in quote, a place they'd never look. Despite all her double crossings and backstabbings, Paz's legacy ends on a somewhat noble note, jumping out of the helicopter right as the remaining bomb inside her detonates. The explosion renders everyone in that helicopter either dead or in critical condition, with the game's final cutscene showing doctors attempting to save the life of Big Boss. A perfect, suspense-filled way to end Metal Gear Solid 5's prologue. Fans would have to wait for over a year just to find out what happened after that helicopter crash. All that time, their anger towards XOF brewing. Critical reception to Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes commonly echoed the same talking points, that the Fox engine was truly a marvel of game design, and with what Ground Zero showcased, the Phantom Pain would be in discussions for the greatest video game of all time. But alongside that praise was criticism towards the game's short runtime and the insanely high price point of $40 for something which essentially served as a demo or prologue to the full experience. In more recent times, it seems this criticism has taken the stage in discussions regarding Ground Zeroes, people commonly forgetting that it was the game that first implemented a lot of mechanics which were later present in the Phantom Pain, saying that Ground Zeroes is only worth picking up, either on sale or secondhand, since an hour of gameplay for $40 could never be worth it. Alongside more subjective criticisms were the reactions to the baffling decision to cut David Hayter from the voice cast. Hayter served as the voice for Snake for nearly 20 years, being the only actor properly credited for his role in the original Metal Gear Solid. The professional voice acting of that game not only revolutionized what video games would become, but also paved the way for voice actors to be properly credited and compensated for their work in the growing medium of video games. It's safe to say, without David Hayter and the fact that he didn't use an alias when doing work for Metal Gear Solid, the world of video game voice acting would be radically different today. So that's why it was so surprising to start the game up and hear the voice of Kiefer Sutherland as Snake.
Down one bit.
Kept you waiting, huh?
Don't get me wrong, Sutherland is a great voice actor, and he doesn't do a bad job portraying Snake. But replacing the man who helped make Snake as iconic as he is, as well as the man who showcased his talents in the first time the Metal Gear series interacted with a third party in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, is just insane. Kojima stated that he wanted to take the series in a new direction, which he did, but said that this change should be reflected in the voice actors as well. As good as Metal Gear Solid 5 is, it doesn't hit the same without David Hayter's quips during codec calls or the numerous iconic grunts he makes while sneaking around or fighting enemies. A lot of the criticism this game received is unwarranted in my opinion. You can make the argument that the reason to split the game into two was due to Konami seeing their rising price of development, and trying to avoid any further conflict, Kojima Productions may have felt it was better to release Ground Zeroes as a prologue to keep fans entertained, while also building up hype and revenue for Konami. People often point to a specific moment in the Phantom Pain where they believe the Ground Zeroes mission would have been placed. And while I can totally see that being the case, Kojima said he wanted to experiment with the way his games were released, comparing the service to that of incremental episodic releases over time. In my opinion, Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes serves as one of the purest, most freeing forms of the stealth action genre of gaming. It perfectly bridges the gap between the old and new styles of Metal Gear, while doing an excellent job of getting fans hyped up for their later release of The Phantom Pain. Seeing the series' main character in the hospital fighting for their life, I think anyone would be dying for more. While Ground Zeroes might not be the longest or most entertaining Metal Gear Solid game, the story of its development, the more serious ideals the story tackles, the hype it built up with its ending, as well as what it introduced fans to in regards to a semi-open world stealth action game, makes Ground Zeroes the most important Metal Gear Solid game of all time. This video serves as a prologue to a larger and more comprehensive video I plan on making about The Phantom Pain. If that's something you're interested in, you should definitely stick around. Although I will warn you, it's gonna take a while to come out. That's a big game. Thank you for watching me ramble on about an hour-long game. It really means a lot to me. But now it's time to start the arduous process of researching for my video on The Phantom Pain. Thank you for watching.